All right, thanks, Linda. And then I think that would be it, and we can turn over to Chair Westerman.
Excellent. All right, good morning, everyone. Oh, it's the start of a new year. In our Dakota language, January is referred to as Witechiwi, the difficult or hard moon, because this is usually the most severe and difficult time of the winter. And it looks pretty nice outside my window right now, so I'll take that. But at the start of a new year, we all tend to have time to reflect and plan. So what have you been reflecting on from this past year, or what are you looking forward to this upcoming year? And I'll start, and we'll go in alphabetical order by last name. I'm looking forward to some new writing projects, and I'm looking forward to a vaccine, taking a vaccine. Okay. Jason Atkins, you're up.
Jason, looks like you might be on mute there.
Sorry about that. You'd think we'd all have that figured out by now. My bad. Good morning. I've been reflecting this past year on the fragility of order and the importance of respecting our institutions and the need to continue to nurture that respect if we want people to act accordingly in a civil and responsible manner in our public discourse. So that obviously keeps getting made more clear, and hopefully 2021 is an opportunity for a collective examination of conscience, as we Catholics like to say.
Thank you.
I choose not to look back. 2020 is a year I would just as soon forget in almost all respects, but like you, Chair Westerman, I'm looking forward to 4 things: vaccine, Biden, hugs, and handshakes.
Definitely miss hugs. Thank you. Dr. Bean.
Hello, my apologies. I was running a little bit late, and so I just signed on. If you could give me a quick reminder of what we are stating.
Yes, it's the start of a new year. So what have you been reflecting on from this past year, or what are you looking forward to this upcoming year?
I am looking forward to my parents being vaccinated on Friday so that they can hug my children for the first time since March. I look forward to our family being reunited and being able to look towards the future, be hopeful, and to seeing my children smile again because they're able to go in places and see people and aren't so lonely. Yeah, man.
Auditor Blaha.
Good morning. I first have to say, as maybe the only person on the call who's not really a hugger, I'm finally vindicated. And I don't necessarily, I tried to hug a little bit, and once you know it, as soon as I try to learn how to be a hugger, this is what happens. And so I think there's a sign in that. But as far as what I look forward to is, you know, when times are difficult and things are heated and emotional, that's usually when I like to try to find something, a point of agreement. And as a math person, it's always been can we find some place to share facts? And are there some things we can all agree on? And sometimes that's the only thing you can agree on is a number. And sometimes you get to that pure, unemotional number place. And that's not easy. We've lost some of that. And so my kind of goal and opportunity this year is to how do we reclaim that sense of reality, and what can we start with, and get back to that trust in science, that trust in basic facts, and some agreed upon reality. That's my goal with my numbers this year.
Thank you. Lindsay Dyer.
Hi, good morning. I've been reflecting, well, thinking about this question, I've been reflecting on like panning for gold and how all the junk falls out and how the gold nuggets stay in your basket or your net or whatever. Sure, the pan, if you will, the pan. And I think that is how I look at last year and maybe upcoming, but especially last year, there was a lot of junk that fell through, but I think that there are so many gold nuggets that can be taken that I know we've all learned so many things about ourselves, our communities, and maybe have new ways of looking at the world. So that's what I've been reflecting on.
Thank you. I like that. I like that image. Jessica Intramill.
Good morning, everyone. I've really similarly been reflecting on what is worth carrying forward into the new year, what things might be worth putting to the side. I would love to continue to do all of my work in house slippers from now until the end of time. And I'm also really grateful for this group because I think the intentionality of this group to really sit down and look at what works and what doesn't and for whom is really the sort of work I want to do, and really looking at the idea of what you give energy to is what grows. So I'm excited to continue to give energy to this group.
Thank you. Yay for slippers. Dr. Jolly.
Well, like everyone else, I think I'm looking forward to January 20th more than I ever had in my life. And I've been reflecting recently on, we keep frequently hearing the word unity, and I've been reflecting on the difference between unity and uniformity, and realizing that if we can recognize the many different ways in which we give each other dignity and respect and what the focus of joy is for each other, that unity is sharing that lack of uniformity and supporting the differences between our communities. So that's what I've been thinking about an awful lot.
Yeah, thank you. Tish Jones.
Good morning. I've been reflecting on 2020 as sort of a cultural tipping point, similarly to what Malcolm Gladwell talks about in this book, and thinking about just centuries of systemic and institutional inequities, white supremacy, racial injustice, and the potential. Like I said, I think 2020 was a tipping point for all of that in various ways across the health sector, education sector. Like, we're just seeing those inequities in a major way. And I'm looking forward to releasing our, in some ways, sort of like addiction and need and desire to hold on to some of those old and really detrimental ways that are really about power, and creating something new, a system that actually works for everyone, and decentralizing the need for a very specific amount of power to be central to one group.
That's a lot of reflection in all of the definitions of that word. Thank you. Representative Lee.
Good morning, everyone. For me, it's been reflecting on the health and well-being of my family. Been impacted by COVID this year, but fortunately, we did not have any serious cases within the family, and so I'm really fortunate for that. And looking forward, just hope that we could get back to meeting in person. I would love to have this conversation, the meeting that we're doing right now, and more in person than through team like this. And so hopefully we get the vaccine soon and get back to work in person. Thanks.
I agree. because when we're together, we also get to share food, which is a very enduring quality, I think, for community, and not only sharing ideas, but sharing food. Commissioner Roberts Davis.
Good morning, everyone. I have been reflecting on things that we took for granted in the past. Watching TV shows, I see people sitting next to each other in a movie theater, or shaking hands with someone, or hugging someone, or having a coffee or a dinner with friends, and just really thinking about how much those things were taken for granted, and how much I won't take those things for granted when we're able to do them again. And as I'm looking forward, I'm really hopeful that we can let go of some of the social and political fear that's grown in this past year. So that's what I'm looking forward to in 2021.
Thank you. And Daniel Yang.
Good morning, folks. Been doing a lot of reflecting about the friends and family and colleagues that helped me get through this and get on the other end of this year, and then looking forward to reconnecting with them in person, like many other folks have shared.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for being here today. I hope you were able to enjoy some downtime over the holidays, and it sounds like everyone has managed to stay safe and healthy, and we're all looking forward to a new year and regaining connection. So I was encouraged by our deep dive into the existing commemorative works policy during our last meeting. We talked through a lot of content, and you provided a lot of valuable insight, and that's encouraging to me. Some of the key themes that emerged from our review of the existing policy included overall inaccessibility and the difficulty of the language and the lack of clarity surrounding definitions and processes. And that, I think, is going to be a focus of a lot of the work that we'll do from this point forward. We also identified key gaps, including a lack of deaccession or the removal process, no definition of terms that are used, and no clear timeline for the decision-making process as it stands. There were missing documents and forms, that there's a need to include up-to-date maps, application forms, and a web interface for this process. And from this discussion, it was also clear that more information would be helpful in guiding the next steps in drafting new policy language. So that's why we've structured today's meeting as we have. We're going to hear from Paul Mandel on the Nellie Stone Johnson statue and other past decisions that the CAP board has made when it comes to commemorative works on the Capitol building, or on the Capitol grounds and in the Capitol building. David Kelleher will then present on the process that the Minnesota Historical Society has undertaken over the past year to review the existing policy for art within the Capitol. And we'll conclude with a presentation from Dana Badgerow on the results of her review of other similar processes across the country. And by the end of today, we will have a better understanding of the CAP board decisions that have been made in the past, similar work that is going on with a different group, and a few good examples of how other jurisdictions are handling similar discussions across the state and country. Tomorrow, we'll hear from Chair Carl Crawford, who is leading the Public Engagement Task Force, and he will give us some background on the work of that group and how our two task forces will complement each other in terms of moving forward with new policy and processes. So you all know I'm thinking about today as mostly information gathering day and tomorrow as a synthesis and discussion day. And my hope is, my hope is that by the end of our discussion tomorrow, we will have a clear sense of the drafting work that will need to be done ahead of our February meeting, and that we'll know who is doing that work. So we'll be moving into the writing process after our 2 meetings this week. So let's get started. And Paul, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. I'll give you a ton of information, or as briefly as possible. Memorials out on the Capitol grounds, which is where the main gap is, have come to be in a number of ways. Those on the what we call the Upper Mall, Columbus, Johnson, Nelson, Olson, and Leif Erikson, all were gifts to the state prior to the time the Cap Board was created in the 60s. At times, memorials come directly to the Cap Board. We work with the client group. It could be for a year, it could be for several years, through a process where, first of all, we decide if it's statewide significance, citing, and then design through a design competition. Firefighters Memorial, for instance, came by means of the legislature needing to save a piece of sculpture that was at the airport and was in the baggage area and needing to be removed because of new security measures that were being taken where you could not enter the airport unless you had tickets. So that was an authorization without funding that the Cap Board shall cite and execute design for a firefighters memorial incorporating the sculpture currently at the airport. Same thing happened with the peace officers, although that came from the peace officers themselves, not through the legislature, to the Cap Board when they had a piece of stone that had an inscription and the state map that they wanted to save when it needed to be also relocated out of the airport for security reasons. Military family tribute was totally privately funded, came through the Cap Board, and had no legislative involvement whatsoever. Others have started with us, and then have gone back and forth to the legislature for appropriations of numerous kinds. In one case, some legacy money, maintenance funds, repair funds, etc., with the Cap Board, usually involved from the citing, which is our requirement, and then a design competition, which is usually blind competition, so we don't necessarily pick the big name architect. They pick a design, and then the designer is divulged after a jury of peers, the client group, Cap Board, legislative members picks the design. There's the Capitol Workers plaque, which was executed during the past most recent restoration project to recognize the 6 workers who died when the building was being built back in the turn of the century, as well as all those who had worked on it before. That came through legislation from a group of 6th graders in Owatonna School. It required that the Cap Board hold a design competition with 6th graders statewide to execute a plaque that would acknowledge the 6 workers who died building the building. So their whole appeal was, everyone knows Cass Gilbert, nobody knows 6 people died during the construction. So we held that competition, and that plaque was funded. There was no funding attached to it. The funding came from the Capitol Building Restoration Funds through the Department of Administration, and they installed it. There are times when things have changed. Well, let me finish first. The Nellie Stone Johnson piece was, it came through legislation, again, to authorize creation of a statue or bust with an appropriation of $30,000 that needed to be matched to finish the completion of the bust or statue. The client group decided to fundraise the maximum amount to pay for a full statue as opposed to just a bust, since this would be the first woman in the Capitol. That took several years. At the beginning, I think there were efforts while Nellie was still alive, actually, and that violated policies that her place in history had not yet been established. So the legislation was never passed until such time as it fulfilled with the appropriation, and the Cap Board held a design. We went through an RFQ, request for qualifications, to make sure someone could do the work necessary to meet the standards, since it would go in the Capitol building of bronze. We weren't looking for something abstract. We were looking for something literal, of a life size, and it would last. After the RFQ, we had an RFP, and that involved, we had members of the client group. We had actually family members. We had representatives from the Historical Society, the Cap Board, and we had design professionals on the jury that picked the sculpture designer. And that work is still underway, probably to be installed, I suspect, within the next year, 2021. So that started with the funding, and that had to be executed according to MHS Statute 138, 67 through 70, which involves the Cap Board and Historical Society in both the siting and design and standards and materials. Things that have been changed over time, the USS Ward Gun, which was a relic from the first, what they called the first shot. It was they actually sank a 2-person Japanese sub that was entering Pearl Harbor. It was actually predated, or it was the first shot. It was called the first shot because it was before the Japanese had actually fired anything against us, but they saw the periscope and sank it. That was moved from a site along John Ireland across from the DOT building to make way for the Roy Wilkins Memorial, and in part because the event that surrounds that gun, there are now, I believe, 3 or 2 members left from that gun crew. Obviously, they are very old, so the ceremonies are usually held in the 5th floor of the Veterans Building, and it's held on December 7th. So usually it's very cold and adverse weather. So we moved it closer to the Veterans Service Building to help also facilitate their event. That was a Cap Board decision. We needed this space for spaces along John Ireland Boulevard are reserved for Minnesotans, which is why we have Humphrey and Lindbergh and now Roy Wilkins. So the gun was moved both out of to comply with the comp plan thematic organization of the mall, but also to make it more convenient for those who are most interested. The Governor Perpich portrait back in the 90s, Governor Perpich wanted a second portrait, and this one with Lola. The rules are that you get one portrait regardless of how many terms you serve, and it's of the governor, not related people. He at the time compared it to Al Quie, who had his horses, and the Cap Board ruled against that, said you can't have multiple subjects, and you already have a portrait that was paid for by the state. Eventually, the legislature said, irregardless, or they said, basically they overruled the Cap Board, and they said, regardless of what the Cap Board said, we agree with them, you get one portrait, but if you want to spend your money, you can replace your previous portrait that was paid for by the state with a portrait of your preference. And that could include Lola. What he had wanted to hang was not a painted portrait. It was a photograph enlarged to the size of a governor's portrait with varnish brush strokes over it. And if exposed to light, it would eventually disappear. So it was not a painting, it was a photographed. So that did not meet the standards of either Historical Society or the Cap Board, in that it had to be a painting that would last, of oil painting. So they then had a new portrait made showing the same subject. They paid for it, and that was allowed to replace his older portrait, which showed him on the Iron Range. I think I spoke to you before at one of your earliest meetings. There was the Spanish-American War plaque, or I think it's called the 13th Regiment, that freed the Philippines from the Spanish. And it is in the rotunda. It's a historic plaque that was honoring the 13th Regiment, but it had inaccuracies, calling their lead, the Philippine leader, a chief, which he was, but he was also an elected president. It also talked about all the Americans that died freeing the Philippines from the Spanish. But the fact of the matter was, they kicked out the Spanish, but then the Filipinos had to fight the Americans to get their independence. And it didn't mention anything about Filipinos who died in that pursuit. So the Cap Board, working with the client group over the space of a year, revised our policies, and then created a new plaque above it that incorporated the corrections and made it look like it was at the same time dated. So it had artistic renderings on the sides and throughout the bronze plaque. So the two of them now hang, so that rather than obliterating the history, we supplemented it with a corrective plaque. There is the Ed Burdick bust outside of the Minnesota Minnesota House Chamber that violates Cap Board and Historical Society policies. It was created there in the alcove, which is considered part of the public space, at a time when he had just retired but was still alive. First of all, it's the public space, so it's under the governance of the Cap Board and Historical Society. So the Minnesota House passed legislation, or they basically said, they just ignored it. They claimed the alcove as now house space, not public space, and then created a statue to Ed Burdick, despite the fact that he was still alive and well. Obviously, because the Cap Board is created by the legislature, anytime the legislature wants to, they can just ignore us by legislation and say, notwithstanding anything of the Cap Board, you can do this. The Chair Westerman and others here were involved with the Capital Preservation Art Subcommittee, at which time we moved the two paintings, the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux and St. Anthony Falls, out of the governor's reception room and up to the third floor, so where they could be reinterpreted more adequately and wouldn't be behind the governor when he was doing press conferences without any explanation of why it was offensive. And then we moved completely from the Capitol two paintings, New Ulm and Killdeer Mountain. It's Killdeer Mountain, which is actually took place in North Dakota, but it was one of the other regiments that was Minnesota Volunteers, and that has been those two paintings were removed from other rooms in the Capitol during the restoration, and I believe are to the best of my knowledge, they're in storage at the Historical Society, but they're not any longer at the Capitol. And that is a summary. If you need more details, I can answer questions. So a variety of ways things can happen with all private dollars with Cap Board approval, siting and design, state dollars matching private dollars, state authorization without any money attached to it. Several of those, we have like 12 or 15 memorials on the Capitol grounds, all of which have now been fully restored the past year and a half. But they've all come through the Cap Board either starting with the legislative motion, or starting with Cap Board and involving the legislature, or going through the Cap Board with no legislative input, but the Cap Board involved in first site determining statewide significance, then determining site selection, and then design. And after that, of course, it's out in the public for fundraising. So you have both the cap board process and the fundraising process where the public is made aware, because obviously there are things that have failed for lack of funding. And there are memorials that have come to us, or proposals, I should say, that have come to the cap board where either the board and or staff have said unlikely to pass. There was a proposal for a Bob Hope statue, and the question came up of relevance to Minnesota. There was one proposal to have battalion flags from different armed forces units. And the concern there was once you start down that road, we'd end up looking like a used car lot with nothing but a bunch of flags that no one could spend the time raising and lowering. And it was a dangerous precedent. There was a proposal, excuse me, Willard Munger, after he died, House member Willard Munger. Our suggestion at the time was we could entertain that since he had died and obviously was a well-known figure, but would he really want, knowing Willard Munger was all about state parks, would he really want a concrete memorial on the Capitol grounds? And I believe they took our advice and pursued something in one of the state parks. There was a proposal for Paul Wellstone Memorial right after he had died. And at the time there, first of all, he was a national figure for sure, certainly a Minnesota figure, but it had just died. And in the space of time, within a year, there was a proposal that has happened where his, near the site up in Eveleth, there was a memorial using county property very close to the site. I was involved in actually running a design competition for the family to enact that design, and that is within earshot of where the plane went down that killed the Wellstones. And at one time, there was one other proposal that got turned down by the board action. There was a proposal by the son of Koya Knutson, who filled a vacancy in the House and was made famous with the famous Koya Come Home letter. Her son was trying at the time to get a movie, and so had started writing a book, but he thought it'd be more likely to get a movie if he could say there was a proposal and a law to give her a memorial. And the board heard that. There was a piece of legislation drafted by a member of the Minnesota Senate, and he appealed to the board for a decision on that. And the board turned it down, saying, this is really a family member who wants to get a tagline, and our memorial spaces are too tight, and with the mall belongs to the people more than just one person. So the board turned him down, and that never got enacted. Nor did the bill pass. So that was turned down by official board action. Questions?
Thank you, Paul. Jessica has a question. Would you like to ask it?
Thank you, Dr. Westerman. And I really appreciate all of your detail, Paul. This has been really helpful. I'm wondering who paid for the Spanish-American War plaque, the second additional interpretation plaque?
The client group fundraised for that. And it's a good question. I don't believe, no, I take that back. There may have been some state appropriation. I'd have to check and verify that. But at one point they were going to get involved, and they said, should we have a bill to get rid of the plaque completely? And we said, well, we're working with the client group, and their preference is just make a corrective one. So we were able to enact that instead. And I think there was an appropriation for that at least partially paid for that with state appropriation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Are there any other questions? Okay. Thank you, Paul. That was very informative.
Good. You're welcome.
And now we'll turn it over to David Kelleher from the Minnesota Historical Society.
Thank you, Chair Westerman. I'm going to go very quickly through a PowerPoint to give you an update on where we at the Minnesota Historical Society, working with the CAP Board, are on revisions for policy for works of art in the Minnesota Capitol. And again, making the distinction between, you remember the matrix that Paul and I walked through at one of the early meetings, distinction between the Capitol Mall and inside the building, and Minnesota statutes have different processes for those. I think Paul's summary was really helpful in general, but also from a couple of standpoints to illustrate the multiple points from which requests and funding and authority for works of art in the Capitol and on the Mall can come from. They can come from the general public through the CAP Board or others, but they also come often through the legislature. And I think that's something that needs to be factored into the conversation, that people think, well, if I want something in the Capitol, I'll talk to my legislator and they will drop in a bill. And Paul does his best to educate legislators on what the existing process is. Sometimes people respect that. Sometimes people say, well, we're the legislature and we make the rules, so we're going to make this rule. So that adds to the confusion when there's multiple entry points for having this conversation. So again, I'm going to just go through what the process has been for inside the building. You all have spent most of your time, the majority of your time, on the Capitol Mall, but just to put this in context, I'll talk about the Capitol building. Again, back to that matrix that we talked about several weeks or months ago, Minnesota statute, as Paul mentioned, 138.67 through 70 talks about works of art in the Capitol building. And our role primarily at the Minnesota Historical Society can be broken down as preservation and education. We do the school tours and the public tours, and we advise the CAP Board and the Department of Administration on best practices for preservation, but also have a authority role in addition or subtraction of art in the Capitol building, specifically in the public and ceremonial spaces, which are defined in statute in 138. Next slide, please. And specifically 138.68, as you saw on the matrix several weeks ago, says that the CAP Board and the Minnesota Historical Society are responsible for design, etc., for works of art located in the Capitol or which shall be placed in such public or ceremonial areas after June 4th, 1971. I'm not quite sure what happened on June 4th, 1971. Maybe that was the effective date of this law. But, next slide, please. So to put some definition onto that statute, over the years, the CAP Board, working with the Minnesota Historical Society, has developed a policy for works of art inside the Capitol building. It's a joint policy. There's a copy of it available on the CAP Board's website. It's been revised. Paul knows this history much better than I do, but I think it really came up after the Perpich portrait, and the feeling was we needed some more definition to what the statute defined and some standards and guidelines from which to have a better process involved. So the most recent revisions were 2015, which really were just technical revisions to update statutory changes, and 1998, after the conversation started with the Filipino plaque that Paul mentioned. And that was the most thorough revision because really there wasn't a process in place, or the policy did not really address how a work of art may be changed or removed. So that was addressed in the 1998 revision. Next slide. So again, the existing policy, this is what the table of contents says on the existing policy. It outlines the statutory authority, has the principles section, standards, design guidelines, and the process. And the process does include additions and removals to works of art. And then it has several appendices, floor plans, preservation standards, Secretary of the Interior standards. And then it also has some categories and examples of specific works of art in the Capitol that give you a sense of why things are there and the types, the typology of different works of art. Next slide. So after, as Paul mentioned, after the preservation project with the Capitol, the conservation of some of the artwork, most of the artwork in the Capitol, and the work of the Capitol Preservation Commission's art subcommittee, we in conversations with the art subcommittee and the Cap board thought that there needed to be some revisions to this policy and making it clearer what the process would be. So when some of those changes that Paul referenced, such as the relocation of the two paintings in the governor's reception room, we, the Minnesota Historical Society, have a governing board called the Executive Council, not to be confused with the Executive Council that Auditor Blaha is a member of with the constitutional officers. Our governing board appointed an ad hoc art subcommittee to both consider the changes that were being discussed and take action and make recommendations, but then also to take a look at some of the changes to the policy for artwork in the Capitol. So certainly their work was informed by the Capitol Preservation Commission's art subcommittee and the recommendations that that committee made. And then moving forward, that group's work will be informed by the task forces, the work that you're doing right now. And I certainly, we're learning a lot as these conversations are going on about accessibility of the process and some of the things that Chair Westerman went through from the last meeting. Next slide, please. So again, you all hopefully had a chance to look at the Capitol Preservation Commission's art subcommittee, but some of the principles that they put forward for works of art in the Capitol are important and are things that we would look at in revising the policies. Next slide. So where we are at, our ad hoc subcommittee has really been moving in fits and starts on this. They got a good start after the Capitol Preservation project was done and moved forward. We had a new executive director. We've had a pandemic, so it's moved from the front burner to the middle burner to the back burner to the middle burner. And I think when the conversations were starting for these task forces, we thought we would stop again and learn from what you all are learning before moving forward any further. But this is about as far as we got. This is a outline of, we have a draft that's absolutely not ready for prime time, but an outline is a starting point. A purpose statement is a new feature of this, and some revisions to the other sections. So that's really where we are at. That's it for this slide deck. Is there one more slide behind this one? Yeah, so I just included the links to the statute. So we are in process with doing some revisions and very much a work in progress, but not ready for distribution. But again, we are learning from these two task forces to inform our work moving forward. And I would mention also that Paul was involved in most of the meetings of the ad hoc subcommittee of our board to do the work of doing some revisions. So I'd be happy to answer any questions on.
Thank you, David. Paul Mandel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just David's well aware of this too. The distinction to be made here is the Cap Board and Historical Society, as he talked about, govern the ceremonial and historic public spaces. And the third party that's now involved, Department of Administration, governs the new, quote, non-historic, non-ceremonial public spaces. We have the gallery, mostly on the third floor, east wing. We have several rooms on that east wing. In fact, virtually all of those rooms, plus the hallway, is under the governance of the Department of Administration, because those were newly created spaces that used to be basically offices, caucus rooms, hearing rooms, etc., as well as the basement and a few other key locations that aren't historic, that aren't ceremonial, that are now public, but were not historic or ceremonial. So those, and obviously, as David pointed out, 2015 did not include those new spaces because a lot of space changes took place during the restoration. So the maps you will find in the 2015 edition are, to the general public, look fine, but they have not been updated to reflect the changes that occurred during the Capitol building restoration.
Thank you. Any other questions? Jason.
Thank you, Chair Westerman. Mr. Kelleher, could you describe the process by which the Father Hennepin and St. Anthony Falls painting was contextualized up on the third floor there, and how that input was solicited for that process and what eventually is displayed there?
Sure, I'll give that a shot. The first step in that process was the decision to move those two paintings to another location in the Capitol. That was not something that we had done. We all had done before, so we needed to figure out what process needed to be followed for removal and relocation after, and I think you're specifically asking the relocation and interpretation piece of that. After those decisions were made to do a relocation in a specific spot, our staff worked on trying to provide some context for those paintings within the building. So our staff, and I wasn't directly involved with that process, so others can speak better to that process than I can, but our exhibit staff worked on that, as well as others in our Native American Initiatives unit, to do some interviews with people from various vantage points, viewpoints, to discuss what the meaning of those paintings were to various Minnesotans and types of Minnesotans. So if you go into that room, there are, which we can't do right now, there are interpretive panels with the voices of a number of Minnesotans to discuss. And those viewpoints range from academic people to citizens, to public officials and others. The other thing that's important in addition to those viewpoints is there are some interpretive panels that contextualize the history of those two paintings specifically within the Capitol building itself and its history, and within the time period of the Capitol building's construction. The 1905 perspective of the world is very different from today's perspective. So trying to get the viewer, visitor into that mindset of 1905 was a very different time period from today, and we should consider that and consider how we look at things today. So it's in a location where that room, the Cass Gilbert room, is open most of the time, and people can go in there. It's a quieter space, which is appropriate to have it be a learning space and a contemplative space rather than the governor's reception room, which at any given moment can be quite busy and cacophonous with sixth graders visiting and press conferences and meetings and whatnot. So I think it's the Cass Gilbert room up on the third floor. While it is not as busy, that's a positive to have that be a quieter space. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that background and context. It doesn't seem that it was a public process in which public input was initiated, though, and that's kind of the heart of my question is how did that happen and can we avoid that in the future? My office submitted multiple requests to be able to participate in that interpretation process, and those requests weren't returned or even followed up on. And I wouldn't say that the interpretations that are up there are exactly a model of viewpoint diversity. So I think that there's something that can be learned from that process about going forward and how we might want to do things different. Thank you.
Thank you. Your point is noted.
Paul Mandel, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, the initial decision that it had to be relocated and it was going to be kept in the Capitol building was a thoroughly public process. However, coming out of the Capitol Preservation Subcommittee, Art Subcommittee, and then the full Capitol Preservation Commission itself, and then it came down to as far as where it could go. Because they were so large, you had to find walls that could bear the weight and the scale of those paintings once they were framed and encased, because they didn't have their own frames. So as to the interpretation, no. As to the decision to move them and the fact to keep them in the Capitol was actually two public bodies that vetted that one.
Thank you. Any other questions from the task force members for David Kelleher's presentation? Okay, then. Well, we are about halfway through our agenda here, so we'll take a short 5-minute break and then reconvene. Time to stretch. Hydrate. I will ask everybody to be sure your microphones are muted. Thank you. Okay, let's see. Peter has put a phone number on the chat board for any technical issues. I don't know if anybody else has been experiencing any, but I've had a little bit of trouble with my sound, so we will reconvene. So I hope you are ready to go, had a chance to stretch and rehydrate. And now we're going to hear from Dana Badgerow about policies and processes regarding removal and deaccession from across the country. So Dana, you are on the air.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Dana, if I could just interrupt really quickly, Chair Westerman, I know that J.C. Thompson, who has just joined us as a support staff member and has worked with Dana, is now on the line if she wants to introduce herself quickly. Dana, before you dive in, is that all right?
Sure, I was going to introduce her myself, but you go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Emmett.
Hello, everyone. My name is JC. I'm a senior at the University of Minnesota studying environmental science, policy, and management. And I'm on this team kind of as a support staff to both Emmett and the rest of the task force. So it's great to meet you all virtually, and I look forward to the work that we're going to do going forward.
Thank you, JC. And thanks for the reminder, Emmett.
So if we could bring up the slides, we'd be ready to go. Thank you, Emmett. Well, let me say at the outset that I'm just a mouthpiece for this group. I'm a public member of this task force and self-appointed to get involved in this benchmarking effort, but I just have to say that the work has been done by staff. And in particular, I was going to actually give JC some kudos because she's done an amazing job, not only at in-depth digging to find these policies and procedures, but also to synthesize them in a rational way that I think makes a lot of sense that we can consider today. Let me also say at the outset, we've got two new terms I think that we've not necessarily dealt with. Deaccession, which is actually a term that comes from the art world. Typically, art collections access and deaccess their works, but it's now been translated over into the public arts field. And then recontextualization, which we were actually just talking about in the case of the two paintings moved out of the governor's reception area. So let's just get started. First slide, please. I think just before we really dig into some of these other policies, it would be helpful to remember on December 8th, we identified a number of key gaps in our own policies and remind that there are more than one, but in particular, we're talking about the CAP board policies. The first of which, of course, is that it doesn't really talk anywhere about the review, modification, or removal of commemorative works. There's kind of a missing vocabulary list and definitions. It's not real clear how folks manage to get through the process. The transparency around decision-making is absent. And the state's values, while articulated in a handful of places kind of disparately, really need to be synthesized in a single place. And we find that in some of these other documents. There's really no documentation or application forms, and there's no web presence where one can get into the process. So the entry point of the process is a little unclear. And then the decision-making process and the timeline as to how it happens needs to be clarified. And then finally, what is the threshold for the process to be initiated? And how is funding identified and the resources identified to get going? So those are some of the gaps we've already talked about. We will find some of those dealt with in the policies of these cities and states. So why were these picked? Obviously, Minneapolis and St. Paul because of their proximity to the capital area. Plus, they're also accessible if we want to talk with them about the examples and life experiences that they've had with their policies. I will say that Minneapolis has a finalized policy on deaccession. St. Paul's is in draft form. The Americans for the Arts actually recommended several of them: San Francisco, Chapel Hill, Fredericksburg, and Florida. They were identified by the Americans for the Arts organization as having model deaccession and removal policies. Albuquerque and Santa Fe apparently have really well-known public art programs, and so it would be logical that they might have also dealt with deaccession, and in fact they have. Richmond, Boston, and Philadelphia have each had their own issue with historical monuments having been removed or sought to be removed, and so we thought to look there. And then Palo Alto and Berkeley just have very robust deaccession policies, so we've included them as well. And then finally, Oregon and Texas have deaccession policies in their state statutes. So there are more, I'm sure, but the good news here is that we don't have to start with a blank piece of paper. There are other organizations and institutions, jurisdictions that have wrestled with the same issues that we're wrestling with. Some have solved them. In particular, I'm really fond of the Minneapolis procedure, and we'll talk about that just a little bit more as we go on. So there are some common elements to all of them, as you would expect, and obviously they all start out with some sort of statement of the objectives of the policy, but some values, some visions, some goals for the commemorative works collection. And I know we've talked about that a lot. We do not have a coherent statement of values for the state of Minnesota that we think is current and relevant. Then why do we have the policy? That's important to state, how it fits into the vision, the purpose, and the jurisdiction. Who's in charge? Who makes the decisions? Terminology and definitions and vocabulary list are present in virtually all of them. And then there is a well-defined process, the criteria for selection, how things happen, the sequence of events, the methods to deaccess, whether they be disposal, removal, relocation, and then the public access, very, very important, as we have talked about and which we know is being addressed. There are some additional elements and process tools. San Francisco, for example, has a sort of the management roles and responsibilities are especially well defined, and there is a provision for an emergency removal, which might be nice to have. The Minneapolis, as I mentioned earlier, I'm really particularly fond of because it's very well thought out, and I think it's one that the work group that moves next is going to want to take a look at. First of all, I have talked with Mary Altman, who is the arts director for the city of Minneapolis. She owns this policy and, of course, has had to implement it. Regrettably, it has not been applied yet. The policy dates back to 2007, but it has not been applied yet to a monument or a tribute piece of artwork. It has been applied, and the process has been exercised so that they know how it works. It was used, I'll digress for a minute, to remove an ice fountain off of Nicollet Mall, which sounds frightening in and of itself, but it was a $350,000 sculpture that actually during the wintertime spewed water and created these ice sculptures. Well, it was a nightmare in terms of maintenance, and it was also a nightmare in terms of public safety. So they did go through this process. They took public input. They ultimately decided to deaccess it. They sought to dispose of it. The city of Maplewood originally thought they might want it, and then they discovered it too would have problems. So they eventually sold it for $2,500 to the company that built the original fountain. So just a minor digression. I also want to mention before I go on, leave Minneapolis, that they also have a draft policy that is in the process of being implemented or finalized called Proposals for Public Artworks that are Memorials and Tributes. So while the deaccession policy refers to art in general, this new policy will also be more applicable to what we're dealing with here on the Capitol grounds, which are memorials and tributes. They have had occasion to apply it, even in draft form, and I can talk about that later if anyone is interested. All the policies, but in particular Minneapolis, emphasizes the necessity to make sure you know where the resources are coming from to implement the deaccession, who's going to pay for it, and who is going to be responsible, which staff will be responsible for doing it. Then we have next some vision language, and I've just got a couple of them here that JC has picked out that she felt were particularly meaningful or helpful. Richmond, for example, I think it's very succinct, consistent and uncompromising quality in public art. They'll commission the creation of memorable public artworks and experiences that, this is important, stimulate discussion and thoughtful reflection and contribute to Richmond's identity and sense of place. Next. So the introduction then in terms of what the policy is all about, we take this from Florida's policy. It applies, as you can imagine, to the disposition or exchange of public artworks that are no longer appropriate for display, and to the process by which a decision is made to transfer title of the artwork from one institution to another, or an individual, or otherwise move or dispose of the artwork. And they reserve the right to deaccess works of art in the public art collection in the best interest of the public and a means of improving the overall quality of the state's public art collection. And then all meetings, of course, are open to public attendance. Next, the definitions, and these are not really, these are just examples of definitions, and some of the titles that some of the words that we think generally need to be defined, but especially deaccession and decommission needs to be defined, and the notification as to how it gets going, what is the process, the disposition, and then lifespans. Many of the policies deal with what is the necessary lifespan of a monument or work of art. And there are various strata, as you can imagine, but mostly, for example, no one considers deaccession until the artwork has been present for at least 5 years, so forth. So those are things that, you know, as we put pen to paper and start working on this, that we will want to have our own definitions. Then here's the heart of the policy. What are the criteria for the deaccession decisions? And they were extremely consistent across all of the policies. And I think here again are some tick lists that we can follow, and I think some ideas that we can include in our policy. Obviously, a threat to public safety, which the ice fountain on Nicollet Mall was. The condition or security of the artwork can't be guaranteed, or the state agency can't properly care for or store the artwork. It may require excessive or unreasonable maintenance. It has serious or dangerous faults in design or workmanship. It requires restoration in excess of its monetary value. The site for the artwork has become inappropriate or is no longer accessible to the public, and that's true even including some of the artwork along Nicollet Mall, for example, has had to be moved. Significant changes in the use, character, or design of the site require reevaluation of the relationship of the work to the site. I think maybe the movement of the World War II gun might have been along those lines. Artwork is of poor quality or has little aesthetic or historical or cultural value. But then finally, there has been sustained and overwhelming public objection to the artwork. And the various policies discuss that as to who might bring forward those objections, how widespread it needs to be, over what period of time that those objections need to be made. Then there's the procedural elements, as you can expect, are those that we've already been talking about here. What is the threshold and method to get the request into the system? Your identification of your resources. It has to be a written request. And in the case of Minneapolis, they have forms and instructions for how one goes about doing that, and a list of who may submit them. The formal requests can come typically from the Public Art Administration, city council, city departments, neighborhood organizations, from almost any place, as long as there's sufficient weight behind it. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the time threshold for consideration. Then there's some kind of commission or committee convening. There's an evaluation and recommendation report. I will digress here for just a moment. Minneapolis most recently received a statue from the city of Morales, Mexico, of Emiliano Zapata. And Emiliano Zapata is apparently very, very important to Mexican immigrants. And the decision was made, should we accept or not accept this work? It's a statue, a bronze statue. They did engage the Heritage Society to issue a report, and so a formal report was issued which found that there is significant nexus between Morales and between our Mexican immigrant community here in Minnesota, and Emiliano Zapata is an important figure to them. Interestingly, they originally were going to place it in Powderhorn Park, and they solicited community opinion under this policy. It turns out that Emiliano is packing heat. He has a gun and a bandolier of bullets. And so the folks who live around Powderhorn Park found it kind of inappropriate. And so they have ultimately cited this statue in a plaza along Lake Street, right amongst the Mexican immigrant retail community. And it sits there now and is very widely
appreciated by the community. Public hearing, of which there was in the case of Emiliano Zapata. And then finally, a commission or committee vote. In the case of Minneapolis, it's actually the city council who votes. But in any event, the policy always identifies who has the final say. So next, the disposition is, pretty clear. You have to clearly indicate where the funds from the sale will go. How will it be deaccessioned? And in the case of Minneapolis, it's simply their surplus property procedures. They offer it to other jurisdictions. They offer it publicly. In one case, they sold an artwork out from the library downtown Minneapolis, and it went for scrap metal. But anyway, you can trade or exchange the deaccessioned artwork for another by the same artist, or you can donate it to a nonprofit organization or agency, and then destruction. And you have to clearly outline, obviously for reasons that respect the artist's work and otherwise, clearly define when you're going to utilize destruction. Next. So then, aside from this, we've already kind of had a glancing blow with the concept of recontextualization or reinterpretation. And we could not really find any policies, and maybe JC can keep digging, but I don't know that there are any policies out there yet on affirmatively or definitively setting forth how one goes about recontextualization. So in the case of the paintings in the governor's reception area, we were kind of plowing new ground. But there is some scholarly work on it, and so this is what JC has given us here, and it just defines recontextualization. It's any strategy that retains the work, but adds to it or alters its context, and thus changes its meaning, which I think is a really important distinction. And the purpose, according to this scholarly work, is it holds human rights violators or violations accountable by keeping them in the public eye, but acknowledges the injustice. Supports the right to full truth, changes the meaning of commemorative work from honoring to reflection, and helps the public learn about past injustices to help fight against future injustice. And I think those 4 bullets really encapsulate what we're about here in terms of any recontextualization process that we might want to define. And I think we've already talked about in practice. I was going to talk here about the recontextualization that has happened in the Capitol complex. So I think, again, I just want to thank JC. She will be an invaluable asset to the teams going forward who are going to be drafting, because while, again, I have this from a 40,000-foot level, she has been at ground level in and about these policies and knows the nits and gnats of all of them. I've never known someone who can retain this degree of detail so readily and yet synthesize it so clearly in a fairly brief presentation. So thank you, JC. So with that, I will open up for questions, and I will probably defer them to JC.
Thank you. Yes. Auditor Blaha.
Thank you. I think my question is, when we talk about recontextualization, are there just some examples of that? I mean, I could imagine where if you've had something that was created for one purpose, and and it was created to honor somebody, and later we have to recontextualize that person because they may not deserve that honor. How do you take something that was built and adequately, what does that look like? I mean, I think we can all agree that changing the plaque, that's something, but how do you recontextualize something, or some examples of what that looks like?
JC, do you have any specific examples?
I haven't dug too deep into any specific examples. I know they've done some work at the Cap Board on this issue, and maybe he can speak to that a little bit better than I can. I was looking more at the broad view of recontextualizing works and what kind of scholars have said about it. So Paul, if you can speak to that.
Auditor, let me just also say that we kind of came, as we put this presentation together, it wasn't an afterthought, but it was something that we came to kind of late in our analysis to add the recontextualization notion, because it's really important. And I think we can dig some more, because I believe there is dialogue going on in some of these particularly Confederate statute situations where recontextualization is being considered. And I think if we do some more digging, we may be able to come up with some examples.
Thank you. I just think that that would be really challenging or expensive, but I'm not saying it's not an option, right? But I can imagine that's got to be a tough option to consider.
102 Confederate statues have either been removed or somehow disposed of. So we have lots of fodder for research, particularly in the area of the Confederacy.
Okay. Paul, did you want to add anything?
Madam Chair, the Spanish-American War plaque would be the prime case of where we have done that here, inside the Capitol, in a very, very historic space, being the Rotunda. You can't get more historic and ceremonial than the Rotunda. I would also allude to, they've just started the discussion, so I don't know if there's anything actually in paper. In this, on the National Mall, in front of one of the Smithsonian buildings, which is a vast number of buildings, there is a statue of Abraham Lincoln with a slave whose chains have been broken, and the objection is he is kneeling. And there have been objections to the fact that he is kneeling, even though the chain is broken. But I know there was some actually national discussion, and I don't know if it's taken anything further than just discussion, about since Frederick Douglass supposedly was at the dedication of that statue, and I don't know if that's actually an anecdotal story or what, it was part of the discussion that if you put a statue of Frederick Douglass standing equivalent to Abraham Lincoln right next to it, that would finish the story in a very just way. But I don't know if that's actually taken light in paperwork or in any kind of proposal, but there was a discussion at NPR at one time, about an hour-long discussion about that particular project.
Thank you, Paul. Tish has a question, and then I'll call on Dr. Bean. Tish's question is in chat. Do you want me to read it or ask it out loud?
I don't mind reading it. The question is there more information available regarding or pertaining to emergency removal or deaccession requests? I'm curious, there was sort of a juxtaposition in terms of when we were going through the deaccession and removal requests around that a certain artifact or piece of art needed to be in place for up to 5 years before even being considered for removal. And I'm wondering if there's any juxtaposition in terms of the emergency removal requests, or if that constitutes an emergency, like that it can't be an emergency until 5 years later, or.
I think they're different, Tish. I think that the emergency could occur at any time. It's the removal because it's no longer valued in some respect that must wait 5 years. The emergency can happen anytime. In fact, I think we can come up with examples of emergency removals that are more quick than that.
Yeah, I think I was imagining that's so. I'm wondering if you all discovered any specific language around the emergency removal requests, if there are policy language proposals that you can point to.
Well, the policy usually for emergency has to do with public safety, deterioration of the work, inability to maintain it. But public safety is typically the number one in terms of, it's just a risk to the public to have this work continue.
Okay, thank you.
And then there was also sustained public objection was number 4, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking about the state of Minnesota and what we've seen in terms of like recent sort of defamation of different public works, and if there's anything specific around maybe that point as well, right? Because I think we're sort of dealing with that, and one of the next things that we're going to be dealing with is related to that. So when there's that level of sort of, public objection, is there anything in the emergency policy language that really speaks to that folks are, I guess, kind of removing the artworks themselves or defamating the artworks themselves?
The two are typically not intertwined, Tish. I will say that we have calls out to the city of St. Paul in their policy, but in particular also calls out to the Minneapolis Park Board, who had two fairly recent instances of desecration of monuments, to find out what's going on there and how they're handling them. And we were not able to make contact yet. So we're going to keep digging there.
Thank you, Dana. Dr. Bean.
You're on
Kate?
mute. You're on mute.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
My apologies. So going back to raising my hand when Auditor Klahr was speaking, and I think that one thing I'm interested in is if policies speak to how we take into consideration public comment, community frustrations that haven't been part of an official public comment process, because we know we hear frustrations from community, but again, there isn't always a formal process for them to express. How do we bring that into account? Also wondering, in terms of scale, in the earlier part of the conversation, we talked about the Hennepin painting, the Cass Gilbert room, the Hennepin painting, and the treaty painting, and the fact that those paintings are so large. I was a part of the team that did look at how to contextualize these pieces, and it's really difficult when you have a very small room and even smaller space for text. It's hard to really show a diversity of perspectives because of space. But then the other piece to it has to do with the scale of the piece and the fact that the piece itself and the fact that it remains is validating its existence. And so in order to show an equitable response to it in written form is very difficult as well.
Hey, Dr. Bean, it was really hard to understand you. It was like your signal was breaking up, and I could make out pieces. It was really important. I don't know if there's something that can be done. It was just hard to hear you.
All right, I apologize. I'm having technical issues. Are you able to hear me now? Okay. Well, one piece was the scale of the pieces. When we talked about the Hennepin painting in the Cass Gilbert room, the fact that the room for text and exhibit is so very small, and the fact that the scale of the piece, the painting is so large, when you're giving a diversity of perspectives in response to it, the painting itself serves as an example. It's being validated for the fact that it is in existence and still there, and it takes up so much space. How do you express an equal, how do you have diverse perspectives on a piece in written form in a very small room to something so large? It's not very equitable, and so I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. Paul Mandel, you have your hand up.
Just a question for either JC or Dana. My mind immediately goes to the sculpture garden and the scaffold, which was certainly met with a huge public outcry. And while I think of that as a public space, I think it's owned by the Walker. But
it is. It is. And Paul, I talked to Mary Altman about that. Of course, she was very heavily involved, but only as an advisor. It was the Walker itself that made the decision to take that down. It had the same issues, though, public input and scale of the item and so forth, but it was not under the jurisdiction of the city.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you. I was excited by the reference to lifespan. When I worked with the Institute of Museum and Library Services, this is a topic that we spoke about. And it means that the relative importance of an issue, of an item, the relative value, often diminishes over time and warrants review. That indeed there's no belief anymore in many museum circles in the permanency of an exhibit. A permanent exhibit is rather called a long-term exhibit. And do you have any more data about the way in which more than one institution dealt with these lifespan issues? It seems to me we've got a continuum that goes from move to explication to removal. And one thing that you're asking for removal often is public outrage, which can pit our communities against each other. Whereas if we look at lifespan and say decreased relevance, given the value of the space, it may be an easier solution than to say, let's put the Native Americans against the Italian Americans and debate Columbus, which it takes us nowhere.
Right.
So are there any additional informations that you have on that lifespan issue that you raised? Is my question.
JC, do you have anything on that? I can tell you that the Minneapolis policy, they actually assign a lifespan to a work when it is commissioned or when it is accessed. So everything has a lifespan from the outset. But I know that it's been discussed in other policies, and I'm just wondering, JC, if you have any other information.
I wouldn't say that there was a particular point of lifespan. It was more a point of, we're going to give a set period of time that whatever the decision-making body is, for them to review the collection. So whether that be 5 years, 10 years, etc., that review process was outlined in quite a few policies. So that may be something to consider and like moving forward. So does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. It's between you and Dana, what I'm hearing is we can do an upfront assignment of lifespan, but we can also do a periodic review of relevancy.
Correct.
Thank you very, very much. That's quite insightful.
Yes, very useful information for us to consider. Jessica Intramill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is actually for Dr. Bean. When her robot voice was happening, I think there was an important first point that we might not have been able to hear clearly. And so I'm wondering if she can go back to that and talk about the sort of the public input piece.
Sure, if you're able to hear me, I hope you can hear me okay. No. If I turn my camera off, are you able to hear me?
Dr. Bean, I can put the number to call in using your phone if you'd like. Then you could be in on audio and we could hear you clearly. So I'll put that in the chat right now.
Okay, that'll take just a couple of minutes if her experience is anything like mine, trying to dial into a meeting. And while we're waiting, Lindsay Dyer.
Hi. Just while we're waiting, I was actually thinking ahead to the question at the end of the meeting on words you notice, and I couldn't help myself in the Florida deaccession policy. I was hearing a lot of subjective words that I wonder if there's a theme. For example, if artwork is inappropriate. And I thought, wow, to who? The other one that tripped me up was requires restoration in excess of monetary value. And that sounds good, but I've worked with a lot of items that might not be worth something in monetary, and but they're very important. And so I wonder, according to who? And then unreasonable maintenance. Again, working with archives and old things, it's expensive. and it's kind of depends on who you ask. And so I think as we look forward to writing and the words, we try and stop and say, okay, if we're using the word appropriate, we have to give some context of what does that mean, or just kind of flag those. I will be doing that at least.
Thank you. That's a good observation. Dr. Bean, are you on the air?
I hope so. Are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I sound like a cell phone commercial. I apologize. Yeah, well, my first comment really had to do with some of the sort of unofficial public comment. So in thinking about the Walker scaffold and thinking about other pieces and thinking about the Columbus statue, you know, when we think about public comment period, oftentimes we don't think about the fact that communities give feedback, they comment, they share their frustrations over many years sometimes. And so, you know, the frustration from the community isn't always something that is held within a formal comment period. And so how do we make sure to take into consideration commentary and feedback from community that we hear that wasn't done in a formal process, but was expressed very assertively by a community?
Thank you. Jessica, your hand is still up. Did you have another question? Nope. Okay.
I can just answer Dr. Bean's question, at least in one case. We do have an example of the city of Boston, which required that there be significant adverse public reaction over an extended period of 5 years or longer. It's one approach.
Thank you for adding that, Dana. It's a good representation, or what you and JC have put together is a good representation, I think, of policies across the country, not only for metropolitan areas, but smaller venues as well, or institutions. Any other questions for our super team? Yes, Paul.
Just to the point, because this is what we deal with specifically here at the mall, I want to express my appreciation to both JC and Dana and Peter too. The difference between public art and memorials, I think of the veterans memorials, where we purposely have always said, you can, you know, we try to encourage them not to include names, because then you get into who's Minnesota and who's not, and there's all kinds of different standards that the Defense Department uses. But, you know, some of those memorials take 5 to 10 years just from the inception to the dedication. And at what point, and we always say, you're not glorifying war. And we want to honor the sacrifice, not the war. We want to honor what they did for their fellow persons, not their actions, be it violent or whatever else. And we try to keep it non-political. But at what point, a memorial has a very different gravity, or gravitas maybe, than a piece of public art. And I want to express my appreciation to both Dana and JC for acknowledging that and specifying that there's a difference there.
Yes, thank you for that. Any other questions, observations? Where we all applaud. The great work that JC and Dana have done for us. I think this gives us a lot to think about. All right. That brings us to the end of our agenda. Let's see if I work here visually and with sound. What I'd like to do is encourage everyone to think about ideas you'd like to bring up in tomorrow's meeting. And we're going to have a significant amount of time set aside for group discussion of some of the information that we've been provided with here today. And it's a lot, but we have a lot of good ideas already here for us to begin to work with. All right. So for our closing exercise, we'll go in reverse alphabetical order. What 2 or 3 words did you hear today that stood out to you? And I'll start with emergency language. That's a new term for me, but it makes perfect sense that it has a descriptor. All right. Daniel Yang.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I was really appreciative of Dr. Jolly's definition of the use of long-term versus permanent. That's a new idea to me, and I think definitely fits in with the conversations that we're holding here.
Thank you. Commissioner Roberts Davis.
The new word that I learned, not to be too obvious, was de-accessation. I think that's what it is. De-accessation. Thank you.
There'll be a spelling test at the end.
I can spell it, I just can't say it apparently.
Okay. Representative Lee. Nope. All right. Tish Jones.
I was fascinated by all of the language around de-accession. Emergency removal and emergency language generated a lot. And I also really appreciated that long-term versus permanent.
Thank you. Dr. Jolly.
Well, I was going to glom onto lifespan, but Lindsay talked about according to whom, and the phrase that I remember was someone said, "Who vetted that?" And that stuck in my mind, because who vetted means who had the power of their value and their perspective and their history.
Thank you. Jessica Intramill.
De-accession was new for me as well, although I appreciate that there is a word for a concept that we've been talking about for a while. The flip of that, lifespan, I think Dr. Jolly had raised it a session or two ago, and I really appreciated today's grounding that and almost in a way personifying some of these monuments and recognizing that the change happens.
Yes, all right. Lindsay Dyer.
Okay, I'm gonna break the rules, and I picked a word that I know, we all know, it's stories, and I heard this a lot today, especially in the presentation by Minnesota Historical Society, and bear with me. I thought it was funny, I was contemplating that word, and stories are usually something that's told, like said out loud or shown, but it's usually not something that you just look at. And then I was thinking about all the stories that we shared about an individual monument. An individual monument has its own story, but that's not the way it's experienced. It's experienced as a whole with all of the other monuments together. And I was thinking about what story the unified collection says.
That's a great observation for the collective story. Thank you. Auditor Blaha?
I think and again, it's not necessarily, it doesn't feel like a new word, but it has very precise meanings in different settings, is public interest. A lot of what I deal with in my work is what is in the public interest. That's what you can spend money on, or that's what maybe the Supreme Court will tell you you can do. So what does public interest mean in this setting is an interesting thought for me.
Great. Dr. Bean?
I was really struck by the conversation around emergency removal as well. And I also think looking at gifting, the fact that certain monuments and artworks are gifted to the state, who is in a situation where they have the resources to gift something to the state, and the level of privilege that requires.
Dana Badro?
I think recontextualization for me is an area that we have a lot of work to do in, and I was appreciative of Dr. Jolly's referencing the Italians who saw to the erection of the Christopher Columbus Monument at a time when for them it was a symbol of their acceptance and was a culturally important thing to them. And now times have changed and it's culturally inappropriate. So I think it's this recontextualization and understanding history and understanding, I think the definitions that we have from that scholarly work in our presentation around what is important in recontextualization is something we need to focus on.
Thank you. And last but not least, Jason Adkins.
I would agree with Dana that recontextualization is an important one. It was the Ku Klux Klan that was one of the principal opponents of the Columbus monuments when they were put up in the 20s and 30s. So that's an interesting factoid for us today and what that might mean. But also process. If we don't have good processes, it just means the people with the loudest microphones often are the ones who speak and whose voice and perspective dominates. So processes are important. And the question for us is, what do those look like and how should they be put together? Thanks, everyone, for a good meeting.
Thank you, and thank you for that tidbit of history. All right, thank you, everyone. We will reconvene tomorrow afternoon and come ready to talk more about what's impacted you, what you'd like to see addressed as we move forward, and what significant ideas there are that you want to set aside time for. Oh, yes, Dana, your hand's up.
Yes, I'm wondering if you could give us a clue as to our opening exercise, just so that we can be thoughtful about it.
Oh, you don't like being surprised and put on the spot.
Especially those of us early in the alphabet.
Exactly.
Yes. Emmett, do we have a preview for tomorrow's first prompt?
Yes, we do have a preview, and I will also note that I will send out an email to everyone, both with the PowerPoint presentations from today and with the agenda for tomorrow after Chair Westerman has kind of finalized that. The prompt for tomorrow is, what is your favorite part of every day? Do you have a time of the day that you most appreciate or something that you do on a daily basis that you enjoy doing?
Now you have 24 hours to think about it.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate all of the thoughtful conversations and comments that we've made today, and I hope you have a good rest of the afternoon. See you tomorrow.
Right, so we have stopped recording.